All right, good evening, afternoon, or day, depending where you are, everyone. Welcome to this webinar hosted by the Finnish Association for Psychedelic Research. I'm Samuli Kangaslampi. I'm a psychologist and postdoctoral researcher at Maastricht University, and I will be hosting tonight's online seminar. A few practical things. First of all, this webinar is being recorded. It will consist of a talk of approximately 1 hour and then a question and answer and comments section afterwards. You can post your questions and comments in the Q&A section on Zoom. And you can also vote for other people's questions there, questions that you would like to see answered. And when it comes time for the questions, I will then pick them out from there and either ask the person themselves to ask the question by opening their microphone, or if you would prefer, you can write in the question that I should read your question for you, or you can post them anonymously as well. Kysymyksiä voi jättää myös suomeksi ja käännämme tarpeen mukaan. Frågor kan också ställas på svenska. I think that's all for the practical issues. Now I'd like to welcome tonight's speaker, Professor Matthew Jonhson. He's the Susan Hill Ward Endowed Professor of Psychedelics and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins University. He has conducted research with psychedelics and also other psychoactive drugs for decades already, played quite a key role in what's being called the modern day revival or renaissance of psychedelic research. He studied psychedelics and mystical experience, personality change, tobacco smoking cessation and addictions, cancer distress treatment and depression treatment, among other things. And beyond psychedelics, things like sexual risk behavior, economics, delay discounting, and other issues related to other psychoactive drugs and addictions as well. Tonight, though, he will be talking about the pitfalls of psychedelic medicine and science. What does that mean? Well, welcome, Matthew. Hopefully you will tell us all about that over the next hour.
Yes, I'll do my best. And so I want to thank the association for asking me to present, and thanks Samuli for hosting. And yeah, I'll get started. And yeah, just by way of disclosures, I have served as an advisor to some companies developing psychedelics or related compounds along the regulatory pathway, the FDA, the EMA, etc. However, I'm not talking about any of those companies or their products or any work directly related other than that general theme of psychedelics. So something that I think is critical in the study of psychedelics to be aware of, and frankly, I think one of the things that has drawn a lot of people's interest into the psychedelics, whether it's the general public or scientists, is that people fairly routinely in psychedelic experiences will ponder what I call the big questions. What is the nature of reality? What is the meaning of life? Does God exist? I don't expect that there will ever be any answer to such questions directly from psychedelics. But in the spirit of, we have to keep in mind that you can study people's experiences, the phenomenology, the experiences people report, and how they interpret them. But this doesn't speak to ground truth on any of these questions. But we have to be aware clinically that in working with psychedelics, for example, to treat mental health, that you're going to be dealing with people, not always, but often, confronting these big questions, or having experiences that for them, they may feel have relevance to these big questions. And therein lies some difficulty in navigating that. What should be our role as either scientific clinical researchers or with the potential approval of psychedelics by the relevant medical regulatory agencies in the different nations? How should we, how should clinicians orient towards patients and their experiences of this variety? And to be clear, what my take on this is one of a scientist and one who wants to inform clinical care. I'm not here to provide any advice to individuals and how they interpret these experiences in any setting, or to, and certainly not to the various religions that have used psychedelics as sacraments, whether it's indigenous cultures or syncretic religions. My advice is geared towards scientific clinical researchers and clinicians, which will probably be a growing number of clinicians who are using psychedelic therapy in straight up treatment. The biggest thing I have to say about this, my advice, is that it's really critical to let patients in psychedelic therapy trials or participants in non-therapeutic psychedelic studies to drive the bus. Fortunately, I've been in over 100 psychedelic sessions as a so-called guide or someone in the room with people having mostly psilocybin experiences, but I've done some work with some other compounds as well. I've never had a patient or participants really ask me to interpret what their experiences mean or ask me any of the big questions myself as if I'm some authority. And I think it's important that we maintain the position that particular answers to those questions really is under the control of the patient or the participant. That as far as these questions go, if they have any interpretation at all to make about at the metaphysical level, their opinion is just as valid as anybody else's opinion. I could tell you what the receptor systems are that are affected by psychedelics. I could tell you something about the brain network activity as affected by psychedelics. I can tell you about what the science has shown us so far and the potential clinical potential effects on personality, etc. But in terms of whether psychedelics are a glimpse into another dimension, whether they have something to do with some religious belief system, whether they are experiences of God of whatever type, the opinion of the participant or patient is as good as anyone else's as far as I'm concerned. One caveat of this is that my advice on these questions is not the imposition of materialism or scientism on patients or participants. In other words, that would be taking a particular philosophical position to questions that we don't ultimately have an empirical answer for. So it's not our role to correct patients on these questions. So, for example, if a participant is in session and says that they had an experience and they felt it was Jesus speaking to them, my colleague Peter Hendricks, who's in the University of Alabama, Birmingham in the United States, it's a very you have a lot of more traditional Christians in that area, and he reports many experiences where people refer to Jesus or other Christian themes from these sessions. Not surprising. Now, it's my advice, it's not on the scientist or the clinician say, no, that wasn't Jesus. That was only your serotonin 2A receptors and your and the same advice goes for any religious orientation, whether you believe the patient believes it's plant spirits, or whether they had an experience of their ancestors, this type of thing. I will say that another caveat is that certainly one should have their, what I call the clinical radar up. It's one thing to have some sort of normative, supernatural or spiritual belief. For example, if someone is a Christian or any other religion, but it's quite another thing for someone to say, yeah, they had, they believe whatever deity is talking, the next day talking through the radio to them and giving them instructions, and their neighbor's dog is conveying such messages. Obviously those are examples that should put up that clinical radar, and that's there's obviously concerns there. But I'm just talking about people's belief systems that aren't checking off DSM or ICD mental health category, diagnostic criteria. So it's not the imposition of materialism, and it is simply, again, letting that person, the patient or the participant, drive the bus, so to speak. And to be clear, sometimes people have these sessions and they don't think about this stuff at all, and that's welcome. They don't have to. They're not supposed to. They shouldn't even be drawn to that necessarily. It's just that, yes, these issues often do come up, and how should we navigate the situation as scientists or clinicians? And so one very practical application of that advice is what should the session room look like? So an area where where my stance differs than actually, I believe, a growing number of researchers in the field. I don't think anyone has data on this particular question, but it's very common to have statues of the Buddha or other religious symbols in clinical research session rooms. And this is a picture that I actually took years ago at Johns Hopkins, and there have been differences amongst investigators, principal investigators, in terms of the appropriateness of having those symbols present. And it was really only after some time that I started to really kind of question, why are we, having, such symbols present. And particularly as we get closer to potential medical clinical approval for these compounds, I often think, even if we don't notice any apparent harm, there may be invisible harms, such as who is seeing these symbols in photos like this and concludes this isn't for me. So I could think of a few. I could think of the traditional Christians. I could think of many Muslims might see, for example, the Buddha and say, "Oh, that's not for me." Many folks, whether one disagrees or not, that doesn't matter at all. There are individuals out there that may conclude, "Oh, this is a false god. This is from a belief system that I'm not a part of. This would be wrong for me." Or they may simply not feel comfortable, even if they don't have hard prohibition against these things. So, aside from these religious groups, you may have atheists, sort of a Richard Dawkins style atheist, who might have a real issue with participating in something that looks like a religious ceremony when that person or the Muslim or the Christian simply wants to treat their depression, or they have terminal cancer and they've read that this can help some people with that disorder, or they want to overcome their alcohol use disorder. I think a goal in the field should be following the data, but to mainstream this treatment. Obviously, there are many associations. This is for hippies. This is for new age spiritual types. And yes, it can. I have nothing. Many of my friends, I sort of identify with many perspectives. Perhaps some of these that I've mentioned to a degree, but nothing personal against any of these. In fact, I think the Buddha often conveys just a tranquility and it's love. I've not only no problem. It's if I eat at a Thai restaurant, there's a Buddha there. I have no problem personally. But it's what percentage of the population is going to really feel welcomed? And I like to remind people that I've seen plenty of atheists go through these trials. Political conservatives, perhaps another association might think, oh no, that's not. This is for far left leaning folks. I've seen plenty of grandmothers who would never touch an illicit drug in their life, all of which, in a good number of cases, I've seen people from these various categories really helped by psychedelic therapy in these various clinical studies that were mentioned in the introduction that I've been involved with. And going beyond just the nominal religious beliefs, I think it's important to realize that, excuse me, I almost had a sneeze coming there. I think it's important to realize that the imposition of philosophy on the supernatural or the religious can take a more subtle form. So many people in the field are probably familiar with what has been called the perennial philosophy or perennialism. And for those who aren't familiar, this is sort of a cartoon depiction. It sort of goes along, if you've heard the kind of the interesting analogy that perhaps the different world faiths are describing God or ultimate reality, like a group of blind individuals may describe an elephant. You grab the trunk, you say the elephant feels like a long skinny thing, and you grab the ear and it feels like this, and they're all disagreeing. It turns out they're all touching the same thing, just different aspects. So it's one of those this example that's been used to refer to the perennial philosophy, which is the idea that all the world's that the world's faith traditions, the variety of them, are all pointing to some core truth, that they have common roots, and that and that they have that in some aspects a common evolution in humanity, and that they also philosophically pointing towards a core truth. Obviously, those interested in psychedelics, many will be familiar with Aldous Huxley. He who wrote The Doors of Perception. He also had a fascinating anthology on this topic of perennialism, the perennial philosophy. I think it's important to point out that perennialism is highly debated and among scholars of religion, and most seem not to adhere to this. Most will disagree, although there's some certainly variability in the field. But I would argue that it's very common for, even if you would suggest that a particular investigator or clinical laboratory or a clinic are not pushing any particular religion, that there's sometimes this theme of pushing this idea of perennialism, sometimes in more subtle ways and sometimes in explicit ways. For example, I showed you the photo. What you don't see in the so-called fourth wall in that photo are a Christian symbol, a Hindu god, so there is a representation which one of various faiths which one might consider perhaps better than focusing on one particular religious faith. But again, what about the person, even if they're in the mix, who, for whatever reason, is not drawn or is even offended by those other faiths? What about the person of no faith who has strong feelings? Again, the Dawkins style atheist. Should we be pushing, or whether explicitly or implicitly, even this more subtle level? You might even call this a meta-religious belief system. Just the idea that the different religious traditions point towards one. And another aspect of this is that, well, I can't really I can't think of an experiment that would experimentally, cleanly address the question of whether the spiritual traditions point towards a core truth. I would say that if someone comes out of these sessions espousing such that they had an experience pointing them towards that belief, even though that could have been culturally influenced by what they've heard, in their life history, it nonetheless would be relatively more interesting had they spontaneously brought that up, and had it not sort of been potentially fed to them by, symbols of the major world religions in the room, or if perennialism had been discussed with them explicitly. And another thing to consider with this sort of this multiplicity idea, like, well, maybe it's okay if you have a variety of symbols present, is that if your goal is to represent all of the faith traditions on planet Earth, there may be no clinic room that is large enough. You would have to include all the gods throughout, all the deities, all of the plant spirits, you name it. And so, so I'd say ultimately that's not even an achievable goal. And so ultimately, I like to use the joke. I recommend BYOB, which I'm not sure that if that may be lost in translation. It's sort of an American college term for bring your own beer, to the party. It's like, come to the party, but everyone brings their own alcoholic beverages. I say BYOB, bring your own Buddha, or your own crucifix, or pictures of your children, or dream catcher, whatever. And it's a very, I like that because it's consistent with this idea of not certainly imposing materialism, but truly inviting the patient to make the experience their own, and being metaphysically neutral, really with keeping in mind the idea that the important part clinically is to establish a solid rapport and to be there to support the individual, not to provide metaphysical or religious guidance. And I'll say that I've had some conversations with those involved with the profession of chaplaincy in my discussions on this topic, and I've actually been surprised and very happy to hear that this stance that I'm suggesting is very much, from what I've learned, an aspect of being a professional chaplain, where you're, in either a hospital or perhaps a military service, and your, job is to provide whatever level of spiritual care for that person who may not be of your religious tradition, or may not have a religious tradition at all. It's not to impose your particular belief system, but to provide whatever level of support that makes sense, and let the patient or the individual receiving care sort of make those determinations. So I'll move on to another topic, another sort of the second of the pitfalls. The first being, let's be metaphysically neutral, let the patient drive the bus in terms of any of those philosophical interpretations. The second is what I call the guru complex. As I mentioned, I've been in dozens of these sessions over the years, and it's quite a humbling experience to be often even associated with experiences that not all, but not uncommonly, and even in the research that I've been involved with, a majority of people will say it's one of a small group of most meaningful experiences in their life. So I think that's that's an incredible honor, and it comes with a great gravity. One can easily, either explicitly, but I think much more commonly, implicitly fall into this trap of thinking that because you are the one providing the access to these meaningful experiences, that somehow you are the conduit to you name it, the divine, God, the universe. And I think, as we probably all realize, regardless of one's metaphysical stance, that there is a long history of people serving in that type of role, whether it be in religions, that if you are the guardian, the medium through which one accesses a higher power within that belief system, even if it's a minority and doesn't fully characterize that group, of course, that this can be abused. And so, of course, a prominent example is the Roman Catholic priesthood, where, my assumption is the large majority of individuals are ethical, but you have this, the sexual abuses that have occurred there. So, this is I think a human potential it's not special to any culture or religious tradition, but it's really kind of this potential that's really there when there's a power dynamic involved, where there's an imbalance of power, when one person is has the power in the relationship, has special access. So I think it's something to be very aware of. And I mentioned sort of the high meaningfulness as in making those types of abuses more likely. The other aspect that makes this possible is the suggestibility. There's some experimental research. It would be great to see more research along these lines that suggests that these psychedelic states can make people more suggestible, perhaps to belief systems, but even subtle unconscious ways. I think of some older research on body sway, whether you can influence it, just simply move their body in a certain direction. So, given this suggestibility, we should step back and consider all of the abuses that we know do happen in the practice of psychotherapy, and in the practice of medicine, where there is that power differential. And it seems no matter how hard we try, and no matter what ethical training we have in place, there is some level of this, and that should never be an excuse to not do our absolute best to minimize these abuses. But we have to be aware. I would say that psychedelic therapy, many of the things that we know, but both on the positive and negative side, that much of what we know about psychotherapy is under a magnifying glass. Perhaps both the potential to heal, facilitate psychotherapeutic process, but also magnify the potential abuses that can happen in that therapeutic relationship. This another sort of pitfall that I'll go over is what I call psychedelic exceptionalism. So this has actually been used in a few different ways. There's a researcher I've known for a long time, Carl Hart at Columbia University, that will use this in a different way. Say, sort of the idea that psychedelics are good drugs, and that other drugs, cocaine, opioids, etc., cannabis, are bad drugs. That's not I've been using this term myself for a long time. It's not that meaning, although I think that's an interesting perspective, and I think there's some truth there, where there can be this our human just tendency to label things dichotomously good and bad, and sort of ignore the nuances within all categories. But by psychedelic exceptionalism, by this, I mean here that because of the magnitude that can often describe these experiences, that one can see psychedelic therapy as an exception to the rules. And I've seen this myself with people. The number of rules can be, I think, large. Violations of confidentiality, in research, the norms of sexual relationships, and this sort of has an overlap with the former pitfall of the guru complex. The idea that you are that these experiences are so big that the normal rules don't apply, including on sexual and romantic boundaries. Probably many people are aware of the incident that the MAPS organization had in their MDMA for PTSD research, where a sexual relationship developed after the course of treatment, but nonetheless inappropriate, ethically wrong, between the therapist, one of the therapists, and the patient. I think that's a reminder that this psychedelic exceptionalism can go on. People can say that these experiences, people go so deep and they become so vulnerable, and the connection between patient and provider can be so altered, such that they're connecting at the level at the base level of as human beings, and they see, for example, the arbitrariness that one person is in this role and the other person is in some other role. And this psychedelic exceptionalism can inspire someone to say, you know what, we're going to ignore all of that, and if there's an attraction here, we're going to go forward with it because we're seeing something deeper. We're tapping into something more fundamental. And I want to make people aware of this, because I think it's a common type of thought, whether it's involving sexual inappropriateness, or whether it's a number of other exceptions that to professional norms in the practice of medicine or clinical psychology, etc. That if you're aware of this potential, at least you can have your safeguards against it. And I think that the advice should be that in being aware of this potential, instead of loosening one's clinical boundaries because of the power of the psychedelic experiences, you need to more tenaciously cling to those professional boundaries, those norms that have been established, and the wisdom that's been established over decades of practice of medicine, clinical psychology, social work, nursing, etc. And of course, the classic example of, I think, this psychedelic exceptionalism was Tim Leary. I don't like to mention kind of, a critique of Tim Leary. Is also saying I think he was absolutely brilliant. I think, he was a brilliant social psychologist. I think he had an ability to articulate many things about psychedelics, the importance of context or set and setting. That wasn't he didn't come up with that concept, but I think he did a better job than anyone before him in really articulating the importance of this. So, highly influential to many people, brilliant thinker. Nonetheless, he was pretty wild, and I think part of what he did wrong was was in part could be described as a psychedelic exceptionism. In his language, he would say things like that these psychedelics are so big that, and I'm paraphrasing, but they don't fit into the academic game, the scientific game. That these were all games that were played, and that this was the exception. That you couldn't ever fit it into these categories and the normal rules. And I think history has suggested so far that he was wrong about that. I mean that you can do good clinical science with these compounds in humans. That you can incorporate them into practice. That you can do. You can engage in a variety of academic fields surrounding psychedelics and not break ethical norms or established ethical, professional boundaries. And so I think and last thing I'll say about Leary is I think he was a wild man, and that's in part why he was such an interesting person, but also I think that's a part of why he was why he made some mistakes and made some suboptimal moves. I remind people he was kicked out of not one but two universities long before he ever took a psychedelic or did psychedelic research. So he was indeed a wild person, and so his perspective, his endorsement of psychedelic exceptionalism should be taken in context. And so I think it's the magnitude of these experiences needs to be dealt with in a professional way. I think we can hold a container with these experiences. There's been a lot of talk about the hype surrounding psychedelics, which is something that concerns me, and it relates to this psychedelic exceptionalism. One of the things that I hear, including by respected researchers, is that psychedelics are going to save the human species. That psychedelics are, they get to the core of human morality. That for us to survive as a species, psychedelics they're gonna save humanity because of this potential. I would argue that this is really repeating one of the core lessons that we should learn from the 1960s, from the earlier era of psychedelic research, not by all investigators, but by some like Leary. This kind of what you could call from a psychoanalytic perspective a ego inflating effect rather than a ego reducing effect. And I think it's important in this field to recognize that there's a lot of good being done in the world. There's a lot of people struggling to help their fellow humans in many ways. And I'll say personally, I'm very concerned about whether we're going to survive as a species. And if we do, I think it's going to take a lot of us doing a lot of different things, addressing the climate, addressing pathogens with our interconnected society. Might we be able to handle it if one day the next great comet comes that could wipe out our civilization and species? Will be now, of course, within the last year, it's on people's radar screen that this question of might the AI take over. There are people working on many things, and there's also people working on making sure people are fed and treated for illnesses in third world nations, and doing a lot of good work that I would say is more legitimately in the category of saving the human species. So don't get me wrong, I think psychedelics are poised to, and I hope, and I think they are likely to represent a strong improvement in mental health care, a new paradigm. I think, perhaps transforming mental health in the sense that, helping many people who haven't been helped. We don't know what that percentage will be. It's never going to help everybody. But, we're in a broader context. And I would suggest if you find yourself thinking that this is the highest work and that this is what's going to save the species, it's time to step back a little bit and appreciate, the incredible work that so many people are doing around the world, to help humanity. And that, hey, I think the better approach is to think that if we can, add just a little bit to help in this particular way, to help our fellow human beings, that's good enough. And that's the more balanced way, and I think more realistic way to hold that. And so I think there's this, what I suggest is, clinging to those boring old ethics, avoid the tendency to throw out the old rules, and again, more strongly cling to the wisdom of those rules rather than to think that psychedelics are the exception. So another pitfall, less related to clinical care, but more related to the science, is the appropriate navigation and phenomenology, the study of these psychedelic experiences. I think some concerns that I've had that have popped up is this, when, for example, examining people's experiences, when you ask them what they think of these experiences, do you believe you encountered God? Do you believe, for example, some substances such as smoked DMT, it's not uncommon for people to say they encountered entities. I did work with high dose salvinorin A. It was actually the higher doses. Most people reported some type of entity contact of some sort or another. I see some celebration of these effects, sometimes in an unbalanced way, where one doesn't appreciate that we don't know ground truth. So, if people are reporting experiences of God, that's interesting. That's science. Even if 100% of participants in a particular condition with a particular drug report experiencing God, that says absolutely zero about the ground truth question that seems to be a non-empirical question. It's more of a personal opinion and philosophy that whether God exists. And there's I'd say a concern about just being sucked into the idea that about the intensity of these experiences, sort of celebrating the fact, for example, that people are seeing God, or you see some movement in some individuals in terms of shifting their beliefs towards a belief in the afterlife, or a belief in God, or the belief that disincarnated entities that one might encounter in DMT experiences are real. And it's important to realize that totally regardless of ground truth on those questions, that clinically, at least for a subset of individuals, believing that disincarnated entities are out there and even interacting with you is going to be harmful. So we need to be very careful and appropriately navigate phenomenology and realize that none of these, you can map, you can describe experiences, but it really doesn't have anything to do with ground truth. I've heard, for this study I've been involved with of religious professionals, various types, priests, rabbis, other religious leaders, receiving psilocybin at Johns Hopkins, and then essentially, asking the question, do they have similar experiences, this so-called mystical experience, which involves a sense of unity, a sense of timelessness and spacelessness, ineffability, positive mood. Does that occur in these individuals who are religious professionals, and basically seeing what they make out of the experience? I've seen a number of individuals sort of portray that as a test of the perennial philosophy, which is just one, even with an incredible sample size, you just can't test it. It has nothing to do with people's experiences. Don't point towards a ground truth on these questions. And atop from that, when you have a study with like 20 people, including like 3 people from this religion and 2 people from that religion, the statisticians among us will know, like, you have zero, essentially no statistical power, even if it were possible for the experimental design to address that question. So as a field, I think we need to just keep this in mind in terms of totally appropriate to study experiences. We just have to always keep experiences are experience. It's descriptive, has nothing to do with ground truth. Another pitfall that I've noticed over the years is sort of a dishonesty in research, or at least a lack of transparency. So something that I've been guilty of, and I recently published a study with colleagues examining the history of control conditions in psychedelic research. One of the things that we reported is a very small percentage of studies even attempted to so-called assess the blind within blinded studies. In other words, just ask the participant afterwards, do you think you got the real thing, or do you think you got the placebo condition? And there's a history here in not wanting to ask these questions because, frankly, a suspicion that we're going to get the answer that we didn't want to hear, and that could be weaponized to critique this research. In other words, the idea that, yeah, probably most people are going to cut through the blind. And indeed, that analysis, that paper that I mentioned, Nyack et al. Published a couple of years ago, that's what we found, that that in the large majority of cases, people were able to correctly guess. Not in all cases, and I do think there's value in, introducing noise into the system, even if a majority of people correctly guess. There's still value in maintaining a blind, but we should be asking the question, and because then you could do a number of things in the research to address the potential. If your statistical power is high enough, you could attempt to address the degree to which the blind may have related to efficacy, and then potentially with other measures, you could sort of relate to the question of how might a measure of expectancy affect efficacy for the disorder. So we shouldn't be afraid. I think this should have always been the advice, but nonetheless, even if someone were to argue that it was justified in the earlier days of this research, which I agree with, it's certainly not the case now. I mean, we're about to unleash this on potentially millions of people in clinical care. I think we need to just be radically honest about what the effects are, including risks, including the limitations of the research designs. And another thing that falls in this category is not wanting to ask participants about subsequent psychedelic use after their experience in trials. And I can tell you that some participants, my impression is it's a relatively small percentage, but some people will become inspired to use a psychedelic again. We should really know this again before we unleash this on millions of people. What effect is that going to have? Maybe for some people that's not, I would imagine, depending on how they're using it, the context, maybe that's not a bad thing for some people. it's certainly possible for some people that it could be a bad thing, but we need the data, and we need to not hide from it. Sort of and an early example of some of this, don't ask the wrong question, or don't report the results that might be used to be weaponized against you. In the original Good Friday study, Rick Doblin of the MAPS organization years ago published a 25-year follow-up and reported that, hey, like not one but two research participants in this 1962 study, the Good Friday experiment, escaped from the research site. They fled. One, because they were listening to a minister deliver a Good Friday sermon. One participant on psilocybin, received the message, heard the message, you'll tell the world there's a man on a cross, and he thought, well, they were in the Boston area, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he thought, well, the best way to do that is to tell the president of Harvard University. So they had to chase this guy down and tackle him essentially, and forcibly inject him with Thorazine to get this guy, in what could, really be described as an acute psychotic state, a delusional state. And so, Rick Doblin made the points, hey, this should have been reported. And I think that's the right, but there was the sense at the time that presumably that if you had reported that would have been very bad for this kind of fledgling field. And so, again, I think we need to, stick to the transparency about our results. And there's concerns about, I would say, in some of the research, we really need to be concerned about leading participant responses. I've been doing research with a lot of areas of psychology and a number of drugs over the years, and it's certainly possible to lead the witness and to be very, very careful with things. For example, if an investigator believes that the experience in their discussion with the participant was seemed very meaningful to them, but then the participant provides a moderate mark on a scale of how meaningful the experience is, to go back and then ask the participant to, oh, well, it sounded to me like your experience was was stronger, more meaningful to you than the number 3 on the 5-point scale. Are you, would you want to reassess this? This can really drive the data, and in such a situation, one has to wonder, would that same investigator have asked the opposite question? And how often does that happen? Oh, the experience that you described actually in our conversation seemed less meaningful than the score that you provided on the scale. That's probably not going to happen. This can be nuanced because I've done animal and human research over my years, and it is humans can speak, and using that verbal behavior can really help science in terms of questions. It's appropriate in cases where, for example, it becomes clear that the person is not understanding the question. Perhaps they mix up the valence of, like, what is more or less on a particular scale, this type of thing. If that becomes very clear, yes, make sure just being very cautious not to drive the to lead the witness, so to speak, but be very careful and certainly be very reserved in doing that, and only in such cases where one strongly suspects there's truly a misunderstanding of some basic feature of the scale, when before prompting them to reassess their answer. And I think I already spoke about this a bit, sort of the adverse reactions, such as the person fleeing the study site. But another aspect is the how these potential adverse events are conveyed. And so one particular experience that that I'll share is that a particular person, I wasn't a guide in the study, in our in some of our research at Johns Hopkins, was standing on the couch, which was, the person should have been encouraged earlier to kind of to lay down, to sit down on the couch rather than sort of dancing or standing up on top of the couch. But I reviewed the video of this incident, and this a lady. What I'm showing you in the photo is an artwork that was a painting that was on the wall of the session room, right next to the couch. Would have been to the left of this, that the person was laying on, should have been laying on, but was in fact standing on during the experience. And I saw the video where this lady, it looked like she was diving into this painting, and it looked as if she fully expected to be sucked into the painting. And I shared this on an interview on a podcast, and really when I was really trying to describe the fact that there are some rare reports of people believing that they could fly after taking a psychedelic, and then, jumping off a balcony or off of a cliff. And I will say, from having looked at some of these cases, it seemed credible that, yeah, that's what happened. This person was really experiencing some delusional thinking, and they thought they could fly, and it seemed like they purposefully jumped. I don't think anyone knows how rare those events are. I think they're extremely rare. Is it 1 in a million, 1 in 10 million, 1 in 100,000? I don't think we know. I do think of the advice of the old comedian Bill Hicks, that if you're on a psychedelic and you think you're going to fly, just test that hypothesis while you're still standing on the ground, because presumably you'd still be able to fly. And if it doesn't work, then you're fine. But just in me describing like the fact that, yeah, at least in some rare circumstances, it appears that these effects are so powerful that people may feel that they can fly, and and they could die depending on how they test that idea. I was conveying that we had a person that looked like she expected to dive through this painting. She ended up bumping her head. It was very minor. She wasn't hurt other than a minor bump, maybe a minor bruise. But this was reported to the ethics board and the FDA. I didn't see the final wording, but there was some real concern by colleagues after I had relayed this story, that the details may, these reports were carefully, the wording was very careful, and that this could scare people. And frankly, I think this is this type of minimization of these harms. Again, we're about to unleash this potentially on millions of people. So I think we need to be really strong in our honesty about, yes, we don't know how rare, but sometimes people do experience delusional thinking, and they may even think something like they're going to jump from a height. Thank goodness that this was not a fourth-story window rather than a painting. So I would encourage the field to really take this up, not to be sucked into this idea that we have to at all costs protect the field such that we're less than honest or transparent about the full range of risks and limitations to experimental design, for example, with the blind. And then the final, let's see, we're at about an hour here, so I'll say relatively quickly that the final pitfall that I want to talk about is, again, like the last one, not necessarily on the clinical side, but on the scientific side, as in with honesty of research, but how we handle questions related to consciousness, because this is quite a bit is made out of psychedelics affecting consciousness. And of course, for a long time, it's people commonly say that psychedelics expand consciousness. These are altered states of consciousness. And so I think the points I would want to make there is that we need to be aware that I would recommend that that consciousness is a term that seems pretty sloppy in the sense that it could be prone to the so-called jingle jangle effects, where in this case, a word, particularly if it's used by the lay population, is sounds like one thing, but it in fact means several different things, and those different things may not even be related. They may be related, somehow associated in the mind of the public, but scientifically they may not be related. So with consciousness, my suggestion is that we look to the philosophers that discuss these things, and recognize that there are different terms to be used. So for example, kind of the biggest concept, if you will, associated with the term consciousness is probably phenomenal consciousness, which is it's the source of the so-called hard problem, or what the so-called hard problem of consciousness is speaking of. The hard problem being, how and why is there an experience to anything? What is it? As philosopher Nagel put it, what is it like to be something like a bat? Presumably, is there an experience there, and if so, what is that experience like? So I think that I would like to be open to the idea that psychedelics could solve the hard problem of consciousness. I'm skeptical that it would. There's no experiment that I could think of where psychedelics or anything else can be used to be brought to bear on that question. But it's good to always be open. But I think we need to be aware that, just because people say that they believe psychedelics subjectively feel like their consciousness is expanded or altered, that we haven't really figured anything out about the nature of phenomenal consciousness. So we need to use better concepts, better terms to define these concepts. Another thing that someone's called, consciousness is access consciousness. And so this relates to the idea that if I bring up some, the idea of your grandmother, maybe you weren't thinking of your grandmother just now, but when I mentioned it, now you're having memories and thinking about your grandmother. Well, that was within your nervous system was some type of storage, and now it's apparently in your awareness. Now, this is not phenomenal consciousness, because it doesn't necessarily it doesn't necessitate an inner experience. So, for example, the same essential process of access consciousness is going on with in a computer where the CPU doesn't have it's not working with something in particular, but then you pull it from the hard drive or from storage, and now it's actively being manipulated and processed, and then you could store it back, and so that's analogous to what we have happens in the memory process. That's really sort of independent of the question of whether there is an experience there with phenomenal consciousness. And there's other concepts such as self-identity, and so there have been aspects of work, not a lot, but with psychedelics that has been somewhat brought to bear, or may have some relationship to some of these other concepts such as access consciousness. It appears to be some evidence that psychedelics can increase access to autobiographical memories, so that there's a relationship in that sense in terms of access consciousness. And then there's a it's certainly been speculated. I think the field has moved on due to some limitations, but an interesting idea was put forth that effects of psychedelics on the default mode network somehow related to the profound effects of psychedelics on self-identity. So that would be another aspect of conscious that's sometimes referred to as consciousness, is the one's perception of oneself as a singular unit separate from other people, other things. So I'd say we need to be conscious of our language surrounding consciousness to begin with, and then just be very judicious with those terms. So that precision in language, and I would say, although I want more work to be done, more ideas to be put out there, but I would want to remind people that most of the work we've seen in terms of the biology, the neuroscience of psychedelics, I would say relates to the mechanisms by which psychedelics work, but does not speak to mechanisms of consciousness, of phenomenal consciousness, or in most cases, any of these other things, concepts referred to as consciousness. I think that, again, there's this sense that because people feel that psychedelics profoundly alter consciousness, expand consciousness, whatever, that if we figure out anything about how psychedelics work, automatically that suggests we figured out something about the nature of consciousness. And I'm suggesting that's not necessarily the case. It's probably more proper and more conservative to say we figured out something about how psychedelics work. And it's really just an assumption that inherently has something to do with the nature of phenomenal consciousness. And so, by increasing, this is sort of a return to the previous section. I think I inserted the consciousness section a little prematurely, but back to honesty and research. I think by maintaining an honesty, we can minimize something I'm increasingly concerned about, a cult-like atmosphere that can stem from the clinical use of these compounds. It can increase the number of people that are clinically helped by not creating these artificial barriers. And it can minimize abuse by patients and increase understanding of negative effects. And I think with that, gone a little bit past the hour, but that is all I have for you. So it'd be great to have a discussion. I'm interested in, certainly not only questions, but probably even more so comments, including disagreements. I've said some sort of perhaps controversial things, some strong opinions. So it'd be great to, just have a discussion of if folks feel otherwise.
Thank you very much, Matt. A fascinating walkthrough through the pitfalls of psychedelic science and medicine as you see them. Yes, I'd like to remind everyone that you can now ask questions or post comments in the Q&A section, preferably in the Q&A. Just a second, my microphone seems to be a bit low. I will fix that. You can take the moment to post some questions.
I didn't quite catch everything, but I do see that Samueli said, but I do see at least one question in the chat, so I guess I'll go ahead and read it, but let me know if I'm misunderstanding the format here. One said, let's see, thank you for your thoughts. I would have one question related to this: being careful when discussing about the experience with the participant. Do you think it would be beneficial to create an understanding of participants' reality, the way of thinking, perspectives, words they use, etc., so the questions can be shaped to fit their reality, and there would not be manipulation, quote unquote, in those cases where the participant finds it hard to understand the question? Or do you think it makes the analysis more complex when the questions are not exactly the same between the participants? So that's interesting. That's a nuance. So I would say there can be, I think there's you could bring up a lot of examples where it would be gray here. But in principle, I think this if I'm understanding it right, sounds sounds appropriate. So something that I do, I think is consistent with this. And for example, my tobacco smoking cessation work with psilocybin is I invite people into manualized therapy as part of the preparation to discuss these various aspects of their life, their childhood, their relationships with people, what they do, if it's a profession or for work, or just simply how they spend their time, whether it's raising family, what have you. But then the final category being their worldview. And that's kind of a very generic term for a reason, because this could be religious or lack thereof. It could be spiritual, but not religious. Some people don't like the spiritual term. So it's just what do you think, whether it's metaphysical, physics, what are what are their thoughts on so-called big questions? And there's obviously no right or wrong answer, but that is, I think, part of kind of getting to know somebody, and that might have some relationship, so you kind of understand their perspective, and sort of you're not surprised, and maybe it will help respond to them should they get them driving the conversation if they bring up whatever supernatural or religious belief system. You have some idea of where they're coming from. So I think that's appropriate. And I do think it's, as long as you're not introducing concepts, I think it's appropriate, to ask, to use reflective listening and to ask probing questions. So if someone said they had a Jesus, they felt that Jesus spoke to their heart during the session, I think it's appropriate to say, what do you think? Can you say what was said? What that felt like? I think completely appropriate. You're not introducing the concept. You're just encouraging them to kind of explore that idea if there's anything more to be said about it. So I think that, hopefully that answers the question. And certainly would be curious if others had opinions.
Right. Yeah, let's wait for some more questions. In the meantime, I would like to ask you a question that is only sort of peripherally related. You mentioned your work with salvinorin A. So it's a rare chance to ask you about that experience and maybe the psychedelic exceptionalism. What would you characterize, based on your research, salvinorin? Salvinorin A, is it a psychedelic? And what makes or doesn't make a psychedelic, in your opinion?
Yeah. And I'll preface this by saying that, this is nomenclature, so there is ultimately no right or wrong. It's we all communicate better if we're using the same language, but there's on many topics there's often disagreement, so there's a difficult path forward. So I think it's important to just define what you as an individual means by these terms. So in my view, it is appropriate to use the term, and I do use the term psychedelic for compounds other than the so-called classic psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, DMT, that are, there's evidence that serotonin 2A agonism is the primary mechanism of action for these. I think it's appropriate to refer to MDMA as a psychedelic. And I would say, the NMDA antagonists such as ketamine, I think that's appropriate to refer to that as a psychedelic. And I also think it's appropriate to refer to salvinorin A as a psychedelic. And so obviously, in my view, it's appropriate to span different distinct pharmacological classes with that term. And so I would define it subjectively as a drug or drug class that, relatively speaking, at sufficiently high doses, can have a profound effect on one's perception of the world, including one's sense of self. And so I recognize that there's going to be edge cases, and you could make the argument that any drug could fit in that category. But relatively speaking, I think the psychomotor stimulants, they're going to make people more euphoric often. They're going to sort of speed them up, obviously, in many cases. Depressants slow people down, make them more sleepy, inhibit motor behavior. relatively speaking, even though there's contextual effects with all of these different substances, but there's a sort of direction to the effect. But for the psychedelic compounds, even across these different classes, these are the ones that could really, impair or alter just one's perception of the world at a much in a much more fundamental way, including even the perception of themselves as an individual. So I would say that's true, at least at the higher doses, for all of the compounds mentioned. And I would just advise that we simply just, if one uses the term psychedelic across those multiple categories, to simply use the additional language if we refer to a classic psychedelic, serotonin 2A agonist, and or if we're referring to you could say an NMDA antagonist, and sometimes it's called dissociative NMDA antagonist, dissociative psychedelic like ketamine, or etc. But that was Salvinorin was a fascinating. Salvinorin, particularly, this was vaporized Salvinorin, going up to about, it was body weight adjusted, but went up to about 2 milligrams, vaporized with a pretty efficient method. And so in terms of profoundly altering one's sense of reality, Salvinorin absolutely met that definition by the people's reports of their experiences. I mean, sort of entity encounters of various types were commonly reported at those higher doses.
Just a short follow-up question. Why do you think Salvinorin A has not been the target of that much research, especially clinical research? There's something different about it that makes it non-therapeutic.
Yeah, I think more research, including therapeutic research, should be conducted. I think a reason why it has not been explored more therapeutically is that the primary way that it's been used by the public, which is what I sought to model when vaporizing the pure compound in the lab, which is essentially very similar to smoking. I mean, when people smoke something, it's much of what is actually inhaled is in fact vaporized, in addition to the products of the combustion, the aromatic hydrocarbons, etc. But so that's why I wanted to use that method to model what people were doing with with good control over the dose. But that method, whether it's smoking or vaporizing, can be is at the relevant doses extremely intense, such that it's probably the case that in that form at the higher doses, there's not much therapeutic potential, because it's just so frightening for some people. It's so sort of jarring. It's so disconnecting from one's ordinary sense of being a person that it seems less likely there are sort of like that there's deep contemplation about kind of maybe personal issues that you might have with other psychedelic experiences, like with psilocybin. But that doesn't mean that that's the only way that people can use Salvinorin. People have developed tinctures, for example, where, as you would expect, it's a slower onset of effect, and much more gentle people seem less likely to sort of forget that they, this extreme kind of experience where someone even forgets that they took a drug, and they're just like super confused about what's happening and frightened because of it. So I do think, given the profoundly altered state of awareness that people have, I think there's a lot of potential there for both sort of psychedelic therapy style use, but also just especially at lower doses. I mean, there's been a lot of interest in the kappa opioid system for years, because you have similar analgesic effects as the mu opioid system, but you don't have the same potential for addictive effects as with mu opioid agonists, the classic opiates we think of, like morphine, heroin, etc. So I think there's and there's some interesting animal evidence suggesting that it might have anti-addictive effects, for example, in terms of decreasing cocaine self-administration by rats. So I think there should be lots of exploration and science. We shouldn't be scared away from it as clinical researchers because we're assuming that all effects necessarily need to be sort of the extreme, jarring effects that people associate with smoking, the compound.
Right. Thanks for that. Yeah, now for some actual audience questions. So Juuso Kähönen had a question. Would you like to read it out loud? Juuso?
Yes, I can. Thanks you for the presentation. I think many of these topics are really important to address and to create this kind of self-reflexivity to the research. I had this question where you were talking about this theme that the experiences people have, do they have anything to do with the ground reality? For example, if people encounter God or something similar, and just this thought came to my mind, or I think there is also kind of very differing like philosophical views and positions on the question, like what is the relation between experiences and the fundamental reality, and do we believe that there are some ways that our experience could reveal the ground reality, and thinking like various like mystical traditions which are largely kind of based on that idea, and just or I totally get the point that as a researchers it's not a kind of good thing to make claims based on the experiences, but also think that it's kind of a genuine philosophical and epistemic question and topic of discussion, like what is the relationship, and also something that perhaps philosophers could more reflect on.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And yeah, it's and I think that relates to some of my nuances in the sense that I would never presume really to suggest to a religious practitioner of whatever tradition how to interpret this, or even really to any sort of regular individual about how to interpret this. It's really just a kind of a message to clinicians and clinical researchers about how they should best orient towards patient experiences. But actually the point about experience not relating to ground reality, I mean, that is, in terms of the phenomenology discussion, that is an assumption. And I guess I would argue that in kind of conducting the scientific enterprise, that it seems that like we have to be enough on the same page to communicate and that if we could agree to refer to people's experiences as their experiences, then there's that seems a little more straightforward, such that if someone says, oh, my patient or my research participant saw or experienced God, that may be true, and it may be a philosophical question, whether the arguable philosophical question in terms of whether the person experiencing or believing they experience God is evidence of God. But if once we're in that situation, then we can't even communicate with each other without just butting up against fundamental different agreement, different, the language. So for example, if that same person, investigator said, oh, my patient or my participant, reported they saw God, then they're just in the category where it doesn't depend on any philosophical interpretation. If the patient could have lied about their experience, but it seems like it's much more likely that the another observer or a colleague in the field can agree with what they're saying. It's like, yeah, you said your patient, reported seeing God, and they could say, oh yes, like 30% of my participants report seeing God, or whatever it is. And so it, I think it's probably at least more functional, even if there is a philosophical debate to be made about whether, inexperience is evidence of ground truth reality. It's at least more functional in conducting something like science to, stick closer to what we can actually observe. Like, you can report that, oh, my patient actually told me or wrote down that they experienced God. So that part you can, more independent observers could trust than in terms of the actual source of the experience.
Thank you. Yeah, totally agree. And I think it's also like for good epistemic reasons why in science we have this distance between the experience and beliefs we form. Yeah, but also it's interesting kind of tension that can kind of occur, that there is the kind of scientific way to approach this question, and then people might have very different views, perhaps also for good reasons.
Right. And even another nuance related to what you're saying is, like, as a scientist, I could, well, let's see, as an individual who happens to be a scientist, you might have the opinion that, oh yeah, I really think this patient saw God. But in terms of acting like a scientist, like, you may personally believe that, but I guess I would argue in terms of functioning as a scientist, it would be better to say, well, here's what I can report in terms of my observations that the patient told me that they saw. Even if you personally actually think what just philosophically, that you think that what the patient reported experiencing was suggestive of ground truth, that still puts you in that a difficult position in terms of actually conducting science. Yeah. I think all of this makes it a very interesting. I like these kind of philosophical questions. It makes for interesting discussion.
Yeah, perhaps a good follow-up here is a question from an anonymous attendee on whether trying to remain as ideologically, religiously, etc., neutral as possible can lead to the therapist or researcher's beliefs or stances still unintentionally affecting the patient more than they would if the therapist or researcher openly stated their perspectives. This was compared to how it affects someone's argumentation when they try to hide their biases or sort of present an aura of having none versus when they openly state their biases. So what do you think about that? Should researchers perhaps be forthcoming about where they're coming from, what their beliefs are, or try and remain neutral and mysterious, perhaps?
That's a really great. I really like that question, and it's one where I could imagine people, can disagree on the. I'm not 100% sure what the answer should be. I guess my take would be, if the person asks you what your personal beliefs are, there may be it may be the right course. And again, I'm not extremely certain about the right course here, but it might be the best approach to say, oh, well, since you're asking me, I'll share my opinion, but I would say it would be better to preface it by saying, just so you understand, we're getting to a level here where, as a psychologist or a neuroscientist or what have you, I don't have any expertise on this, and my opinion is just as valid as anyone else's opinion. It's really not related to any specialized knowledge that I have. But since you asked, my personal opinion is this. But I do want to emphasize, it's not about what I believe. I've answered you since you asked, but it's, this is all about what you're making of this, if anything. So perhaps that's the best approach. I guess my inclination would be, if that is appropriate, to do that if asked, because rather than sort of introducing it for everyone at the beginning, which my guess is that introducing it for everyone at the beginning would stand more of a chance of influencing people in that direction. But I understand the question. There could be an awkwardness and sort of an insincerity, or sort of this pretending that you're, like you're holding back. And so I guess that's the balance that I would strike. Maybe if you get the question, answer it, but with the appropriate caveats, to just do your very best to let them know that it's a, you don't have any space. This is just your opinion as a person.
Right. A question from Radar Nervander that he wanted me to read. What are your thoughts on the idea that higher doses of psychedelics might increase the probability of more quote-unquote abstract experiences like feeling of unity and spirituality, but lower doses might be more useful clinically as they could alter more concrete problems in the patient's life? Do you think there's a difference like this based on dosage?
Yeah, I think my biggest thought is that that's an empirical question, and we need more research those are sort of the nuanced questions that we haven't even scratched the surface in the science. So, but just, theoretically, I tend to agree. Of course, it might depend on what we mean by a high dose versus a low dose. But certainly one can get to, I think, at the extreme. So, for example, we spoke about Salvinorin, but another example would be smoked or intravenous DMT. People often report experiences that are so bizarre and so sort of otherworldly that it's not like psilocybin, where they had time to contemplate their romantic relationship or some issue that they're having in their life, because they're just, they're just kind of in this kind of intense experience where they feel like their existence is being shredded or what have you, or there are these, entities subjectively. So I think that there may be some truth to that, that lower or at least moderate doses may be optimized for relational issues, but that you get into this more abstract area with higher doses. But of course, a caveat to that is when you're talking about an oral substance like psilocybin, one goes through, as the blood levels increase, even if it's a high dose, one goes through periods where the blood level equivalent is that of a low dose and moderate dose. So in fact, functionally within the same session, you may get essentially a mixture of those different dose level effects. Because even at a high dose of psilocybin, there does seem to be, reflections on one's personal life.
Right. Looking at this in a historical perspective, it's interesting that some people are saying that we should also look at the low doses now. But if you look at the research done in the 50s and so on, these are the low doses. Like 100 micrograms of LSD was the low dose back then. And the high doses were like 700 or 800,
Yeah, and the research with LSD, for example, like Matthias Liechti has used. It's 150 to, I don't know if he's done, maybe I think he's done some with 200, but I think that's the top dose that he's used. There's a little difference whether you're talking about the tartrate or whatnot, but it's not that much of a difference. It's relatively small compared to, and they would say, the clinical researchers would say, oh, for an alcoholic patient, because they have a strongly defended ego, you really need 800 or 1,000 micrograms, for example. It's pretty humbling, because at least on some data, some within subject comparison data from the 1960s, my reading of the data suggests that sort of the 30 milligrams of psilocybin is about equivalent in intensity to about 250 micrograms of LSD. So yes, this is humbling, that, you could go with much higher doses. The folks in University of Wisconsin, Paul Hudson and colleagues, published a study with psilocybin. These were experienced psychedelic users, but I think it was body weight adjusted, but I think they went up to absolute doses of around 60 milligrams or so for the heavier individuals. So they have gone up to pretty high doses. I would say just somewhat related, particularly since I mentioned Leary in the talk a little bit. Leary said that at one point you didn't need to give more than 30 milligrams of psilocybin, which is kind of an interesting statement. Coming again, he was kind of a wild man, so it does make you a little maybe a little cautious when Tim Leary is saying, "Oh, well, that's too much. That's too crazy to go higher than that." But of course, maybe LSD and psilocybin are different. It's anecdotally, and this could be complete just not scientific, there may be no basis, but some folks have said that psilocybin, as you keep increasing the dose, things become more bizarre in kind of a less interpretable way, whereas LSD, maybe while things become more intense as the doses increase, it's nonetheless more interpretable, more sort of psychologically useful. It's sometimes been described as more psychoanalytically abrasive and sort of putting the problems in front of you. But again, there's no real science behind that. I'm just kind of reporting what some folks say, in terms of trip reports and whatnot. But there's a lot of science to that we need to do to explore this. Maybe LSD is one is more able to keep going up to higher doses and still get clinical import out of it.
Right. Another question from an anonymous attendee that you touched on a little bit. Although researchers should not advocate any specific worldview, do you think it's helpful to encourage spirituality in general? It adds that also it would be interesting to see empirical research comparing settings with spiritual elements versus maximally secular settings.
That's a great question, because it actually reminds me to make a point that I should have made during the talk, and that spirituality is a really sloppy term. maybe it's like consciousness in that sense. It can mean different things that really aren't the same. So by spirituality, you could mean finding meaning in life, whatever that is, just the idea that life has meaning, that you are connected to others in some sense, that you're connected to your family or your friends or your community. You're connected, you're part of the human species, and you have some responsibility, and that's meaningful to you. Richard Dawkins would probably agree these are important things. So these are the aspects of spirituality that are completely secular. It's sort of that perhaps you could call it those a higher order aspect of psychology. May not be a perfect way to describe it, but and then you have by spirituality straight up supernatural beliefs. I believe in this deity versus that deity, or I believe this origin story because of some religious tradition and not that one. I believe in this just the straight up supernatural things. And so I think it depends on what you mean. I think you can maximize the secular spirituality in a way that doesn't necessarily imply anything supernatural at all. And I think that I think it can certainly be appropriate to do science even with the religiously with religious content, if people are informed that that's the thing being studied and that's what they're getting into. Perhaps similar to a nuance around these topics that I've conveyed before is that just like I'm not providing recommendations to what any religion should do if they use psychedelics as sacraments, it's also possible for something. There are some, at least in the United States, I don't know how common it is elsewhere, but for people to they may be a psychologist, but they advertise themselves as Christian therapy. They have a PhD, but they're telling you they're a Christian. They operate from a Christian perspective. They draw from theology. I think that's fine as long as it's being transparent, so don't be surprised if you hear about Jesus if you go to a Christian therapist. So, I think that's another nuance here. Because one is being transparent about that, yeah, they are operating outside of the, normal secular, something you could show empirically. They're operating from a religious perspective. That's, I guess, in some sense, sort of halfway between the two. And so I guess in a similar sense, if someone wants to enter a study of saying, oh, we're going to, compare conditions between a very secular setting versus one with these explicit, religious context. I think if someone knows what they're signing up for that and they know that's the case, I think that's that might be one of the nuances, by which that's okay. I mean, maybe the person is of that religion and they welcome that. So a lot of this may be about just how we are describing it, and we're not just, what I'm most concerned about is we're just saying, oh, this is straight up, the practice of clinical psychology or psychiatry, and they think they're just getting depressed, and now it's getting depression treatment or addiction treatment, and you're introducing these things, and that's not what they were looking for.
Right, might be a little more than they bargained for in that case.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a question here from Peik Oberg. Would you like to ask it yourself?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes, great.
Oh, great.
So yeah, similar topic. I was thinking on the topic of not like influencing your participants' beliefs. I'm thinking, do you think it would be appropriate to kind of explain a certain experience through a metaphysical belief? So for example, a participant has a feeling of oneness with the universe and trying to kind of explain this through some kind of monism or idealism. Because I was thinking like it could help with the integration process, but it could also kind of lead a person to a certain belief.
Interesting. Yeah. So these would be more sort of philosophical schools of thought, not necessarily. I think in the example, philosophical schools of thought rather than religious traditions. Yeah, that's an interesting nuance. And again, sort of like a previous question. I could be wrong, and I'm not entirely certain about it. It's an interesting nuance, but perhaps if one appropriately labels it and say, that relates to the school of thought of idealism, and this is what that school of thought says, and here's another school of thought, but they may also say, but there's no empirical, it's philosophies, there's no empirical proof for either one, and so I can't, I'm not telling you which to believe, but just to hope to that's a perhaps that would be appropriate. But there is a risk of like sort of endorsing, and is that appropriate? It strikes me as less of a risk than kind of introducing really religious concepts. I mean, at least there is a tradition that if the person wanted to read about that school of thought, they could read the philosophers. It's these things are based more on, of course, logic and in the best of it, given assumptions, and then you follow the philosophical argument. So that's, again, not empirical, science, but that is ideally, based on, rational thought and a laying out and manipulation of ideas that at least one could go to and evaluate themselves. So perhaps, but I have to think a little more about that. That's an interesting example.
Yes, Juuso Kähönen pointed out in the chat that Peter Sjöstedt Hughes at least has suggested this sort of offering of metaphysical options. I think he spoke of like offering a menu of different philosophical standpoints that people could understand their experiences from, perhaps.
Yeah, that seems similar to the previous, and actually that's a great answer, and I think yeah, Peter certainly has some very interesting input to a lot of these questions, but that actually strikes me, if one is going to go down the road of the last question, that would make it a better thing rather than say, oh, here's one, but here goes 5 different, here's everything we know about, here are the, all of the major, philosophical opinions on that question. And, here's this buffet menu that you can select from. That's interesting because then it sort of like, requires the, that level of philosophical knowledge on the part of the clinician that they may not have. So perhaps that's a limitation. Perhaps the best clinician will be more aware of those positions. I will say though that I've never, not to say it doesn't come up, but I've never in working with patients, perhaps this is because I take this orientation and I don't kind of present myself as being any sort of authority at these things. I really don't remember someone asking me like really for their interpretations or for what it means. So I'm not sure that in a lot of, not to say it can't happen, but I'm not sure even how important clinically in terms of helping people with disorders that it would be. But yeah, I like this. We're getting into some really great. You're stretching my my thought process here to consider lots of really interesting nuances.
Yeah, agreed. A couple of more general questions, perhaps. What are your thoughts on the growth of naturalistic or free-range use of psychedelics? It has been a rising trend in many Western countries, Finland included. Could add here that the share of people who have tried psychedelics has about doubled, I think, in Finland in the last 10, 15 years. So it is an increasing trend. So in your opinion, will the prevalence of psychedelic experiences in the population affect the clinical research positively or negatively, and why?
I think it could do both, and it probably does do both. Like a lot of these kind of population level questions, it's complex. There's probably, in one sense, perhaps the more people are familiar with psychedelics, and we do know that there are dangers. Some people try psychedelics that the chances of entailing a risk that is not addressed and is certainly higher in the wild or without supervision and help. But it's also true that the large majority of people who use psychedelics in those cases are fine. I'm not suggesting people use it, but this is the reality, like most things. I mean, it's also true that most people who try cocaine don't become addicted. We have data on that. So I'm not telling people to try cocaine, but so given that most people try, even if the risks are higher, given that most people who try psychedelics don't have major harms from it, one potentially, and again, I'm not endorsing it, but just stepping back, maybe there's more of a potential for someone recommending psychedelic medical treatment to, for example, their aunt who has cancer, who otherwise wouldn't consider it, and maybe her nephew says, oh yeah, no, but I've taken, he could say, I've taken mushrooms, and hey, trust me, this really is something interesting here, and from my experience, I could see why this could help someone, and so maybe in that particular situation, it's encouraged someone who might benefit from treatment to adopt it because it's more normalized and someone that they trust. And on the other hand, I probably don't even have to describe, there's a million different ways where they could, obviously the more people that try psychedelics, the more, even if it's rare, it is rarer for people to have catastrophic harm compared to many other drug classes. It's not non-existent. So there is a risk. Sometimes people do get into accidents. Sometimes people with schizophrenia or with potential for schizophrenia are destabilized. Sometimes people with severe heart disease may have a cardiac event because it modestly increases their pulse and blood pressure. So the more people to do it, the more instances of those things you're going to get. So just a couple of examples where it could be both. You get some benefit, not that I'm recommending it, and you get some, you would certainly get some, increased harm. I mean, almost by definition, the more people adopt a tool with any potential for harm, you're going to get increased rates of harm.
Right. Getting towards the end of our session, but maybe one more question from the audience, and then I might have a short question myself. Another anonymous question related to this is, do you have experience or information regarding administering psychedelics to patients or individuals with known history of psychosis or schizophrenia or otherwise prone sensitive to altered states of consciousness? What is your take on the appropriate ethical precautions and considerations in relation to treating individuals in this group with psychedelics? Could add here that it is interesting that back in the 60s and so on, this was a major question, like could we treat people with schizophrenia or psychosis with psychedelics, but nobody has touched that question at all, I believe, in modern research, maybe with good reason, but what do you think?
I think that's a great question, and I've said this before that I don't want to say that you can never use this to treat those disorders, and I have heard anecdotes of people saying it has helped them, and I'm open to that there being a reality there. Just practically, we do it through clinical observation. It seems clear that there's at least a risk in making those disorders worse. We don't need a randomized controlled trial. I think there's enough just examples where there has been harm that's seemed convincing enough that it's safe to conclude that we're sure that it can potentially be a risk and harm people. But there may also be, if done in the right way, theoretically, I mean, perhaps this is dose dependent and context dependent. Perhaps it depends on what happens during the experience. I'm open to the idea that there could be some potential of benefit. I would say practically, as a field, that shouldn't be the first thing we study. And perhaps 20 years into the modern era, maybe now is the time. But I think the relevant question is, if you are going to go into an area like this, the relevant questions I know to the EMA or the FDA are, okay, what are the risks? How are you going to identify them? And what are your rules? Convince us that you're going to stop this, even if you determine in the first few patients that's something, or even in the first patient, if it seems something has gone wrong, that you stop. And so I would imagine that you just have the best, frequent assessment of an increase in psychotic symptoms, and that you have a very light threshold for determining, like, if it seems like you're making someone worse, you stop. But and a number of other things. For example, you it seems ethically, if you were going to explore this, that you would start with people who, like for example, with depression, made the place in terms of research studies, like people that don't that are treatment resistant, that have tried other things and they haven't received much help, and so there's a case to be made that it's worth the risk in those people versus people who are getting pretty decent relief from some more traditional therapeutics. So and here's another thing: to have real expertise in psychotic disorders. One of the things I've seen is just a little bit too much of a tendency to think, oh, just because you have the expert in the psychedelics, especially as you go to more serious mental health disorders, you need not just peripheral, like central expertise in those disorders. So, and there's probably other caveats that I haven't thought of yet, but extremely cautiously, one can be open, but going in that right order and just and you know, just really making sure you don't harm people, and you're able to tell if you start to harm people.
Right, important points. Maybe a final question I'd like to ask is, you've worked both with psychedelics and with many other psychoactive drugs. What's different and what's similar about conducting research with psychedelics and conducting research with methamphetamine, cocaine, tobacco, and so on? What's exceptional about psychedelic research in your opinion, experience, in terms of maybe the bureaucracy, the media attention, and just personally as a researcher?
Yeah, really a lot. Certainly the attention to the work is just, you know, absolutely different, an increase, which, you know, yeah, obviously there's a good aspect in this sense. I think, you know, most scientists, they want their work to have an effect. They want both other scientists and the public to pay attention to their work. So that's a, you know, that's a positive, but there can be a lot of trouble as well, when your words are misconveyed in headlines and this type of thing. That's you know, things sort of get complex. Things get a lot of that type of media attention. In terms of conducting the work, it's certainly because they're Schedule I compounds. I can tell you from experience in the United States anyway that oh yes, yeah, I've done research, you know, administering cocaine and methamphetamine to people. Importantly, ethically, in those cases, those are the regular users that aren't seeking treatment. And you know, basically, if they're doing it routinely, hey, do it a few times with like pure product, you know, with a physician, you know, right there able to respond. So, you know, safer than you're doing it under, and we'll do it. And hopefully by doing that research, we're going to learn something to help treat people or to understand the nature of these drug effects. So I always feel like I need to provide that caveat. But it is ironic that it's because those are Schedule II compounds in the US, and I know it's similar in many nations. It's way easier to get those compounds and to administer them. Which is just wild, because by virtually any assessment, I mean, even there's dangers to all of these things. Like, yeah, there should be more concern about methamphetamine and cocaine. You know, the relative dangers are greater. There are certain aspects of you know, that you know, at more common doses, you're more likely to have an acutely delusional behavior with psychedelics. But on so many other aspects, that the physiological dangers, the addictive potential, obviously there's far more danger with some of these other substances. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. It doesn't really fit reality, that it you know, the regulation and the restrictions are so high, compared, you know, even within scheduled drugs. And I would say in terms of managing people, it can be a challenge sometimes with psychedelics, but it's even at relatively high dose, it's pretty rare, although it has happened. I've been with people who are in this state of saying, I think I've gone permanently insane. I don't know if I'm ever coming back, you know, stop this, you know. I think with good preparation, you get relatively low rates of that, but that sometimes happens. But I will, and that's very challenging. And thankfully there are rescue medications, and sometimes reassurance works to help people through that. But if I had to say the most difficult substance to work with all around, I'd have to say it's high dose alcohol. I've done some studies where you basically get people really drunk, like the equivalent of 6 standard drinks. And the standard drink is a little bit stronger in US than it is in Europe. So it's like, maybe it's more equivalent of like 8 drinks for at least the UK standards I'm more familiar with, in terms of grams of ethanol. But yeah, you get people really drunk, and you just see, you know, inappropriate behavior, and people, research participants pushing boundaries that, you know, they're, you know, weren't an issue when they weren't intoxicated. So I have to say, overall, it's a bit of an apples and oranges comparison, but alcohol is in many ways the most difficult psychoactive substance to manage, you know, getting people intoxicated on in the laboratory. So yeah.
Fascinating to hear. Thanks. Yeah, thank you so much, Matthew Jonhson, for being with us tonight and answering these questions and comments. It's really enlightening, fascinating to hear your talk and this discussion afterwards. Do you have any final words, Matt, that you'd like to say before we bring it to a close?
No, just thank you so much. I enjoyed the opportunity to speak with you all, and thanks for the, yeah, and it's exciting to about the enthusiasm for psychedelic medicine and research in Finland. So keep up the interest and the work, and best of luck.
Great, thank you so much, Matt. And thank you everybody for participating. If you'd like to see more of this kind of activity, you can join the association. You can see more information at our website, syty.fi, psyty.fi. And we do have some webinars upcoming as well. I think the next is with Dr. Sandeep Nayak. And there is also a conference coming up in November. Still maybe about 10 tickets left to the second Finnish interdisciplinary conference on psychedelic research happening in Turku in November. So you can see our website for more information on that as well. We do also accept donations. If you have a lot of money and you'd like to support psychedelic research, then also go to our website and have a look. All right, thank you everybody and have a good evening.